I came home 2 days early to surprise my husband, only to find a pair of cream sandals at the staircase. They belonged to the only other woman with our key. I thought I was walking into a cliché affair, but by dawn, I realized it was a plot to steal my assets. Their fatal mistake was expecting a shattered wife, rather than a fraud investigator who spent over 10 years hunting people like them. My name is Stella Baker, and I am 37 years old. The heavy, sweet air of Savannah clung to my trench coat as I stepped out of the rideshare, pulling my overnight bag up the familiar brick walkway of my own home. My annual risk assessment conference in Philadelphia had been abruptly canceled due to a massive venue power failure, sending me back down the East Coast exactly 2 days earlier than planned. I had spent the entire 2-hour and 45-minute flight imagining the look on my husband's face when I walked through the door. Dean loved surprises, or at least, that was the narrative I had believed for the past 5 years of our marriage. I turned my key in the heavy brass lock with practiced, unconscious care, a habit born from years of coming home late from the firm and not wanting to disturb his rest. The solid oak door swung inward on silent hinges. The house was bathed in the soft, bruised amber light of late afternoon, dust motes dancing lazily in the beams cutting through the foyer windows. I stepped inside, letting the familiar, comforting scent of beeswax wood polish and Dean's signature cedarwood aftershave wrap around me. I reached out to set my keys on the silver entryway console, my mind already anticipating a quiet evening, a glass of wine, and the warmth of my husband. But my hand stopped mid-air. My breath hitched, catching sharply in my throat. There, sitting slightly askew at the very bottom of the polished wooden staircase, was a pair of cream-colored sandals. They were not mine. I did not own a pair of shoes so delicate, so utterly impractical for the uneven cobblestone streets of our historic district. But I recognized them instantly, down to the microscopic scuff on the left heel. I had been there when they were purchased. I had complimented the intricate braided leather just 3 weeks ago over our usual Sunday brunch. They belonged to Maris Vale. Maris, who had been my closest confidant, my sounding board, my absolute best friend for the past 8 years. She was the only other woman outside of my immediate blood relatives who possessed a spare key to our home, entrusted to her strictly for emergencies. I stood frozen on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, the silence of the house pressed against my eardrums. Above me, the floorboards of the second story creaked. The sound was faint but distinct, amplified by the high ceilings of the old Victorian architecture. Then came a sound that made the blood in my veins slow to a glacial crawl. It was laughter, soft, melodic, and entirely uninhibited. It was Maris's laugh. A moment later, the muted rush of water echoed through the antique pipes as a bathroom faucet was turned on. Beneath the rushing sound of the water, a male voice murmured something low, resonant, and deeply familiar. Dean Hollowell, my husband. His voice held that specific, gravelly timbre of postcoital intimacy, a private tone reserved strictly for closed doors, whispered secrets, and tangled bedsheets. Any normal woman would have dropped her heavy leather bag right there on the rug. Any normal wife would have screamed, run up the stairs, and confronted them on the spot. I felt that primal, violent urge flare in the back of my throat. It tasted metallic, like copper and ash. I wanted to tear the house apart, but I swallowed it down. I forced it deep into my stomach. I did not rush the stairs. I did not call out either of their names. I did not make a single, solitary sound. Instead, I gripped the leather handle of my suitcase and lowered it to the hardwood floor with the agonizing slowness of an explosives expert diffusing a live bomb. The rubber wheels did not even squeak against the varnish. Almost instantly, a thick psychological wall slammed down between my heart and my mind. The warmth and safety of my home evaporated into the humid air. The entryway, the stairs, the shadows stretching across the long hall, they all ceased to be the backdrop of my loving marriage. They instantly transformed into an active crime scene. I crept silently toward the base of the stairs, pressing my back flat against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. I needed to know exactly what I was walking into before I made a tactical move. The running water upstairs abruptly shut off. The heavy, suffocating silence rushed back into the void, amplifying the voices drifting through the cracked bedroom door above me. "You need to relax," Maris said, her voice dripping with a lazy, satisfied exhaustion that made my stomach churn. "I am relaxed," Dean replied, though the underlying, vibrating tension in his baritone betrayed his words. There was the rustle of heavy fabric, the shifting of weight on our expensive memory foam mattress. "But the window is closing. If she signs this week, we are clear." I stopped breathing. The oxygen in my lungs turned to jagged ice. "If she signs this week, we are clear." Those 8 words fundamentally altered the gravity of the room, shifting the axis of my entire reality. A mundane, devastating marital affair was a predictable emotional tragedy. It was a cliché as old as time. But what Dean just said was something else entirely. It was a calculated transaction. It was a premeditated strategy. The blinding shock of romantic infidelity immediately gave way to the sharp, cold, and ruthless clarity of my profession. As a senior investigator dealing with high-stakes asset fraud, I spent my days, weeks, and months hunting down the exact things arrogant people thought they had buried forever. I traced expertly forged deeds, unraveled phantom shell companies, and exposed coerced digital signatures across the entire southern coastline. I knew the nuanced, coded language of thieves. Dean and Maris were not just sharing my bed for a cheap thrill. They were actively waiting for my signature. They were targeting my assets, my livelihood, and the future I had spent over a decade building from nothing. My right hand slid into my coat pocket and smoothly retrieved my phone. I quickly checked the settings to ensure the camera flash and artificial shutter sounds were completely disabled, with the terrifying precision of a seasoned field agent. I crouched down low to the floor. I framed the cream sandals perfectly in my camera app and took a clear, high-resolution photo. I stood up, adjusting my angle toward the vintage grandfather clock standing against the far wall, capturing the exact time 4:17 in the afternoon. I pivoted sharply and took a wide shot of the front door, meticulously documenting that the deadbolt was currently undone from the inside, proving her method of entry. With 3 rapid practice taps on the glass screen, I bypassed my local phone storage and routed the encrypted images directly to my secure, off-site cloud drive. It was a pure professional reflex. If my phone was accidentally dropped, stolen, or forcefully taken from my hands in an upcoming, inevitable confrontation, the digital evidence would already be untouchable. I did not spare another agonizing glance up the dark stairwell. Whatever grotesque pantomime of love they were performing up there no longer mattered to me in the way they confidently thought it would. They had foolishly crossed a dangerous line, stepping from a personal betrayal directly into a criminal conspiracy, and they had arrogantly done it against someone who systematically dismantled financial conspiracies for a living. Moving with absolute, ghost-like silence, I completely bypassed the main living areas and slipped down the narrow, shadowed corridor leading to my ground-floor home office. I eased the heavy mahogany door shut behind me, engaging the brass lock with a barely audible click. The room was pitch dark, the heavy velvet blackout curtains drawn tight against the fading afternoon sun. I did not bother to turn on the overhead chandelier. I walked straight to my massive desk, woke my high-performance laptop from its sleep state, and watched as the stark white screen cast a pale, bluish glow across my rigid face. I opened a blank, highly secure text document. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a brief moment before I began typing with controlled, deliberate force. I typed a single word at the top of the pristine page. Timeline. I sat back deep into my leather chair, staring at the letters, quietly listening to the muffled footsteps moving casually across the ceiling directly above my head. They were entirely, blissfully oblivious to the absolute fact that the ground had just violently shifted beneath their bare feet. In the isolating silence of my dark office, right then and there, I made a singular, unbreakable vow to myself. I was not going to be the tragic, weeping victim of this pathetic story. I was not going to be the blindsided, hysterical wife sobbing uncontrollably in a public divorce court, pathetically begging a judge for a fair settlement. Dean and Maris arrogantly thought they were cleverly writing the final, lucrative chapter of my life. But as I stared at the steadily blinking cursor on my glowing screen, I knew one thing with absolute, terrifying certainty. I would not let the ending of this story rest in their hands. At Redthorn Settlement Group, my official title is Senior Investigations Manager. I do not deal in messy divorces, broken hearts, or tearful courtroom confessions. I deal in the clinical, cold, and hard facts of property risk analysis. For over 10 years, my daily bread and butter has been hunting down exactly what desperate, greedy people believe they have brilliantly hidden from the world. I track down fake transfer orders. I pierce through complex layers of dummy shell companies. I expose forged electronic notary records that look completely legitimate to the untrained eye. When a piece of prime real estate suddenly changes hands under highly suspicious circumstances anywhere along the southern coast, I am the one who finds the invisible thread and pulls ruthlessly until the entire sweater unravels. Because of this, as I sat in the suffocating silence of my dark office, bathed only in the pale blue light of my monitor, I did not attempt to open my husband's social media accounts. I did not try to hack into his personal email to find desperate, cloying messages, hidden hotel receipts, or embarrassing photographs. Romantic infidelity is a matter for a couples therapist or a standard divorce attorney. I was an investigator. I look for the underlying infrastructure of the crime. I bypassed the standard user interface of our home network and dove straight into the raw system logs. My hands were perfectly steady as I pulled up the data for the smart lock installed on our heavy front door. The system keeps a precise, rolling record of every single entry, categorizing them by the specific user code. I filtered the massive wall of data by the unique PIN number I had assigned to Maris years ago, strictly for plant watering and emergencies. The screen instantly populated with neat, organized rows of data. There it was, a clear, undeniable, and devastating pattern over the past 3 months. Maris had entered our home on 12 separate occasions. Almost every single one of those entries occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday was the exact day of the week I reliably traveled out of town for regional field audits and client meetings. They were not acting on spontaneous, overwhelming passion. They were operating on a strict, calculated schedule. They had mapped my calendar. I dug deeper into the digital footprint. I pulled up the main router history to review the connected device logs. I scrolled past our cell phones, the smart television in the living room, my work laptop, and Dean's desktop computer. Then, a foreign device caught my eye. It was registered simply as Maris MacBook. But what made the blood in my veins run completely cold was not the presence of the laptop itself. It was the network it was using. It was not connected to our designated, open guest network. It was connected directly to my secure, private home office network. To access that specific, encrypted frequency, someone would have had to physically walk into this exact room, sit at my desk, open my top right drawer, and manually copy the complex 20-character alphanumeric password printed on a hidden label. My eyes shifted slowly from the laptop screen to the heavy, commercial-grade multifunction printer resting on the mahogany credenza to my left. It was a high-end machine, the kind that retained a local memory cache of its most recent print and scan jobs. I typed the printer's local internet protocol address into my browser and logged into the administrative dashboard. I navigated to the recent scan history. My breath grew shallow in the quiet room. There were 4 specific files scanned just 48 hours ago. The file names were automatically generated by the machine, but the metadata told a terrifying, coherent story. The first file was a high-resolution scan of a property deed copy. The second was a standard operating agreement template. The third and fourth files were the ones that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. They were 2 separate, isolated signature pages. They had no accompanying text, no headers, no legal clauses, no context whatsoever. Just clean, high-quality digital captures of signatures. In my highly specialized line of work, an isolated, scanned signature page is the absolute holy grail for a corporate forger. It is the raw, necessary material required to illegally authorize literally anything. I pushed my chair back. The wheels glided silently over the thick plastic floor mat. I knelt on the rug in front of the heavy steel fireproof safe tucked discreetly beneath the bottom shelf of my bookcase. I gripped the cold metal dial. 3 turns to the right, 2 turns to the left, 1 sharp turn back to the right. The heavy internal bolts disengaged with a solid, satisfying clunk. I pulled the heavy door open and reached past the jewelry boxes and passports for the thick, reinforced manila envelope tucked into the very back corner. This specific envelope contained the complete, original physical files for the historic brick building I had inherited from Aunt Ida. I had organized this file myself. I am a creature of obsessive, microscopic habit, a trait that makes me exceptional at my job. I always place the property tax receipts in strict chronological order, clipped with a smooth silver paper clip, facing the front of the folder. When I pulled the thick file out into the dim light and opened the top flap, my heart skipped a harsh beat. The papers were all there, but the silver paperclip was reversed. The longer loop was facing the back, not the front. Furthermore, the crisp edges of the heavy insurance policy documents were slightly misaligned, jutting out from the stack by perhaps 1/8 of an inch. Someone had removed these private papers, photographed or copied them, and hurriedly shoved them back into the envelope, utterly failing to respect the exact, meticulous order I maintained. It was a microscopic disturbance, the kind of subtle tell that only a highly careful, deeply paranoid person would ever notice. I sat back on the floor, the heavy envelope resting heavily on my crossed legs. The scattered puzzle pieces were slamming together with violent, undeniable force in my mind. Over the past 6 months, Maris had become incredibly inquisitive about my inheritance. I remembered a specific dinner party at a downtown restaurant where she had casually leaned over her wine glass. "How do you even manage the property taxes on a historic place like that, Stella?" she had asked, her eyes wide with what I thought was genuine, friendly curiosity. A few weeks later, while we were getting coffee near the waterfront, she brought the property up again. "Is the property insurance just absolutely astronomical down there near the river?" And then, just last month, while we were browsing a local antique shop, she asked the most specific, bizarre question of all. "I was reading an article about those old downtown buildings," she had said, absent-mindedly touching a silver vase. "Do you actually own the roof access rights to Aunt Ida's place, or does the city council control that?" At the time, I had completely dismissed her pointed questions as the idle, supportive curiosity of a best friend taking an interest in my life. Now, sitting in the dark, viewing those casual conversations through the harsh, glaring lens of the reversed paperclip, the stolen network password, and the scanned signature pages, I saw them for what they truly were. They were strategic reconnaissance. Maris was not just making friendly small talk over coffee and wine. She was actively doing aggressive due diligence. The muffled, rhythmic thud of footsteps from the master bedroom directly above me barely registered in my mind anymore. The initial, nauseating image of the two of them tangled together in my sheets was rapidly fading, completely replaced by the stark, terrifying architecture of a massive financial crime. I looked back toward the closed office door, visualizing the brightly lit entryway beyond it. Those delicate, cream-colored sandals I had photographed just 20 minutes ago were absolutely nothing. They were a pathetic, sloppy oversight born of arrogance. I realized with absolute, freezing certainty that those shoes at the bottom of the stairs were the clumsiest, most insignificant piece of evidence in their entire, sprawling plan. The real betrayal was not happening in my bed. It was happening right here, inside my filing cabinet. I slipped out of the suffocating darkness of my office and moved down the hallway toward the open-plan kitchen, placing my feet precisely on the edges of the floorboards where the wood was least likely to groan. the house remained utterly oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring within its walls. The late afternoon sunlight cast long, distorted shadows across the white marble countertops. Resting on the kitchen island, docked in its sleek charging station, was our shared household tablet. It was the digital hub of our domestic life, a repository for grocery lists, shared calendars, and synchronized family accounts. I picked up the device, keeping the screen angled away from the large bay windows. I bypassed the cheerful lock-screen photograph taken during a vacation to the mountains 2 years ago. I did not care about the upcoming dental appointments or the scheduled reminders to pay the utility bills. I dove straight into the synchronized messaging applications and the joint email accounts. The digital breadcrumbs were scattered everywhere, casually disguised as mundane daily chatter. I forced myself to scroll through the message backups. I had to wade through the sickening, private exchanges between the two of them, the affectionate nicknames, the coordinating of their secret afternoon schedules, and the stolen promises made the muscles in my jaw tighten until they ached. But I aggressively pushed the emotional bile down into my stomach. I was not looking for proof of a broken vow. I was looking for operational anomalies. Soon, the vocabulary in their messages shifted. Wedged neatly between mundane updates about picking up dry cleaning and deciding what to order for dinner were stark, clinical phrases that did not belong in a romantic affair. They texted about a closing window. They discussed inspection pressure. They debated the absolute quickest way to establish temporary authority. These were not the passionate, reckless words of two people consumed by forbidden love. This was the precise, sterile lexicon of a hostile corporate takeover. It began to make a twisted, horrifying kind of sense when I factored in the grim reality of my husband's career. He operated a boutique, high-end wood restoration workshop located near the industrial district. He worked with rare, imported timber, hand-carving custom architectural pieces for wealthy clients who demanded absolute perfection, but routinely paid their massive invoices exactly 90 days late. For the past 18 months, I had noticed the subtle, undeniable signs of a severe cash flow crisis. There was the sudden cancellation of his heavy machinery upgrades. There was the quiet, unexplained dismissal of his 2 junior apprentices. Yet, he always maintained a calm, stoic exterior, acting the part of the unbothered, highly successful artisan. He was a proud man who swallowed his failures and hid his mounting debt behind a thick veneer of rugged independence. Then there was her. She operated a small, highly visible nonprofit organization dedicated to urban conservation and the romanticized preservation of Southern architecture. Her days were spent hosting lavish garden luncheons and shaking hands with the city elite. Her organization was tiny on paper, but her board of directors was a veritable who is who of municipal zoning board members and aggressive commercial builders. She traded exclusively in access and influence. She possessed the exact network of predatory real estate connections that a desperate, financially drowning man would desperately need to orchestrate a rapid, lucrative bailout. I opened a secure, private browser tab on the tablet and accessed the official state corporate registry portal. I cross-referenced the exact dates of their most intense, cryptic text exchanges with recent business filings in our county. It took me exactly 14 minutes of systematically sorting through dummy shell companies and holding groups before I hit the gold mine. A brand new limited liability company had been registered precisely 45 days ago. The entity was legally named Rook Point Holdings. The primary registered address was not a corporate office. It was a generic post office box located in a dilapidated strip mall on the far outskirts of town. But the individual who actually filed the establishment paperwork was not a nameless, faceless corporate attorney. It was her eager, 22-year-old administrative assistant. The paper trail was thin, but to an investigator, it was as bright as a distress flare, armed with this specific company name. I switched back to the household email client. I completely bypassed the main inbox and went straight to the drafted messages folder. Amateurs always forget that email drafts synchronize instantly across the cloud, updating on every single connected device in real time. Sitting right there, untouched for 5 days, was a drafted message originating from my husband's account. There was no recipient listed yet, but the single sentence hovering in the body of the text was a smoking gun. It read, "Once Stella transfers management rights, Sutter can move." The name echoed in my mind like a cracked, discordant bell. Grant Sutter. He was a ruthless, deeply aggressive local property developer who specialized in bulldozing historical charm to build overpriced, soul-deadening boutique hotels. Over the past 4 years, he had approached me no fewer than 6 separate times, offering increasingly exorbitant sums of money for my inherited property. Every single time, I had looked him dead in the eye, flatly refused his offers, and told him the property would never be for sale under any circumstances. The final crushing revelation came when I opened the attached PDF buried at the bottom of that draft email. It was a highly detailed formal property management authorization contract. The document granted absolute, sweeping operational control of my building directly to Rook Point Holdings. It legally allowed them to order structural inspections, sign new commercial tenant leases, and, most crucially, negotiate potential sale terms on my behalf without my explicit, ongoing consent. I scrolled down to the very last page of the dense legal document. The breath completely abandoned my lungs, leaving me hollowed out and freezing in the warm kitchen. There, resting perfectly on the designated authorization line, was my signature. It was not a clumsy, shaky freehand imitation. It was a flawless, high-resolution digital insertion. The pixels blended seamlessly into the document, creating a legally binding, terrifyingly perfect illusion that I had willingly surrendered control of my greatest financial asset. The sheer audacity of the forgery was breathtaking. I slowly placed the tablet back onto the cold marble counter, ensuring it sat in the exact same position I had found it. The brutal, unforgiving reality of the situation finally settled deep into my bones, replacing the initial shock with a hardened, impenetrable layer of ice. The frantic, hushed noises and the muted laughter still drifting down from the second floor were utterly meaningless to me now. The romantic betrayal was no longer the center of gravity in this nightmare. It was nothing but a cheap, colorful distraction. It was a highly convenient layer of thick smoke designed to keep me emotionally devastated, distracted, and legally blind while they executed a meticulously prepared property heist right under my nose. They were not merely breaking my heart or ruining a marriage. They were actively attempting to systematically dismantle my entire financial existence, stripping away the security and the legacy I had fiercely guarded. I stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the ceiling, fully comprehending the magnitude of the war they had just silently declared. The property located on the historic Mercer Row was absolutely not a glittering, modern skyscraper or a sprawling beachfront residential estate. It was a remarkably sturdy, 3-story brick structure nestled in the beating heart of the downtown preservation district, holding its ground with quiet dignity since the late 19th century. Aunt Ida had left it to me in its entirety upon her passing, and the deed had been securely registered in my maiden name well before I ever walked down the church aisle to marry Dean. To the casual, untrained eye walking past its faded green canvas awnings and wrought iron balconies, it appeared to be nothing more than a modestly profitable, slightly aging asset. The ground floor housed a dusty, fiercely independent bookstore owned by a sweet older woman, while the 2 upper levels consisted of open-plan residential lofts that I leased to local artists for slightly below the aggressive market rate. It consistently generated just enough revenue to cover its own exorbitant property taxes, comprehensive insurance premiums, and basic seasonal maintenance. But it was hardly a lucrative gold mine. However, my years at the firm had taught me one absolute truth: the true, astronomical value of commercial real estate rarely lies in its outward aesthetic appeal or its current rental yield. The true value lies hidden in the invisible, rigid boundary lines drawn on dusty municipal zoning maps. I pulled my laptop closer on the heavy mahogany desk, having returned to the stifling, oppressive quiet of my home office. I needed to look at the regional commercial development proposals filed with the City Planning Board over the last 24 months. Grant Sutter had been aggressively, yet entirely quietly, buying up the adjacent, neglected parcels on that specific block for the past 3 years. He was systematically assembling the massive geographical footprint required for a sprawling, 90-room luxury boutique hotel, complete with a rooftop restaurant and subterranean valet parking. But a commercial project of that immense, unprecedented scale in a tightly regulated historic preservation district requires much more than just raw acreage and deep pockets. It requires absolute, uncompromising adherence to modern municipal safety regulations. That was exactly where Aunt Ida's seemingly unremarkable brick building became the undisputed, singular king on the regional chessboard. Deep within the original architectural blueprints, legally bound and permanently attached to my specific property deed, was an irrevocable structural easement. My property held the exclusive, perpetual rights to a shared rear fire escape pathway and a load-bearing roof connection spanning directly across the adjacent, currently empty lot that Sutter had recently purchased. Under the strict, unforgiving current city ordinances, any new commercial hospitality structure exceeding 4 stories in height on that specific historical block absolutely required a secondary emergency egress routing exactly through my designated airspace. Without the legal cooperation of my building, Grant Sutter merely owned a multi-million-dollar plot of dirt that could never, under any circumstances, legally obtain a commercial building permit from the city council. His entire luxury hotel project, his flagship development, was effectively permanently paralyzed unless he successfully absorbed my property and, more importantly, legally extinguished my exclusive easement rights. He desperately needed my roof, and he desperately needed my alleyway. I sat back in the leather chair and meticulously traced the timeline of their shared knowledge. Dean was fully, intimately aware of this immense structural leverage. Exactly 2 years ago, right after Aunt Ida passed away from a sudden illness, he had spent 3 grueling, dust-filled weekends helping me physically clear out decades of accumulated antique furniture and heavy boxes from the second-floor lofts. During that exhausting, emotionally draining process, we had unrolled the fragile, yellowed architectural blueprints across the bare hardwood floor to identify the load-bearing masonry walls for a minor renovation. I had explicitly pointed out the unique property lines. He had read the exact legal clauses regarding the air rights and the emergency egress. He had seen the strategic, multi-million-dollar gold mine hiding in plain sight behind the peeling wallpaper, and Maris. The sickening realization of exactly how Maris obtained her half of the required intelligence hit me like a physical, heavy blow to the ribs. 14 months ago, she had generously, enthusiastically offered to help me host a small, local charity fundraiser on the ground floor of the Mercer Row building to support her conservation group. She had spent countless hours down there over the span of a week, constantly claiming she was organizing the catering tables, arranging the floral displays, and setting up decorative lighting in the secured back storage room. That specific, windowless storage room was exactly where I kept the bulk overflow of Aunt Ida's physical records, tax documents, and historical surveys before I eventually moved the most critical, sensitive documents to my secure home safe. The sudden influx of cryptic text messages, the prolonged Tuesday afternoon visits to my house while I was traveling, the supposed impromptu girls' lunches where she would inevitably cancel at the last minute, leaving me stranded downtown while she essentially had free reign of my property. None of it was merely a desperate cover for a sordid, physical affair. The romantic affair itself was the secondary, opportunistic objective. Her primary, calculated mission from the very beginning was establishing unmonitored, physical proximity to my domestic archives to systematically photograph the structural deeds and ownership proofs. I opened a new, highly secure window on my browser and directly navigated to the Municipal Building Inspector public portal. I typed in the exact street address for the Mercer Row property and hit the Enter key. The results populated instantly on the glowing screen, and the sheer, magnificent audacity of the betrayal made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. Over the past 4 months, my pristine, well-maintained property had been inexplicably hit with 7 separate, highly specific, and entirely anonymous code violation complaints. There were formal, aggressively worded reports alleging severe structural masonry failure on the eastern brick facade. There were urgent, red flag complaints raised regarding supposedly outdated, dangerous electrical wiring in the common residential stairwells. There were even 2 separate complaints citing potential environmental hazards and mold growth in the basement foundation. Every single one of these municipal complaints required mandatory, incredibly expensive municipal inspections to clear. They were a carefully engineered, bureaucratic nightmare explicitly designed to rapidly drain my personal savings, inflate my insurance premiums, and create a suffocating, inescapable sense of legal liability. I rapidly clicked on the public registry data for the private subcontracting firm that had filed the initial, most damaging structural assessments. The limited liability company was registered under a remarkably generic holding name, but the listed managing director made the blood in my veins run absolutely freezing cold. It was a man named Thomas Vance. Thomas was absolutely not a licensed structural engineer or a certified municipal inspector. He was a retired, amateur residential contractor and Dean's former college roommate. He was a man who still deeply owed my husband a significant financial favor from a catastrophic, failed business venture they had attempted together exactly 5 years ago. My own husband had actively, maliciously hired a personal proxy to file fraudulent code violations against my private property. He was intentionally manufacturing a devastating financial crisis out of thin air. The sheer calculated cruelty of the strategy was breathtaking in its ruthless efficiency. The entire, monstrous blueprint was finally laid completely bare under the harsh, unforgiving light of my computer monitor. Dean would create an overwhelming, emotionally exhausting barrage of legal and financial pressure regarding the historic building. He would sit beside me on the couch and watch me stress over the mounting municipal fines, the endless contractor repair estimates, and the threatening letters from the city council. He would flawlessly play the role of the deeply concerned, supportive, and protective husband. Then, exactly at the precise moment when I was most vulnerable, exhausted, and desperate for any kind of relief, Maris would casually suggest over a glass of wine that Dean simply take over the complex administrative burden. Dean would then present the flawlessly forged temporary management authorization document, smoothly framing it as an act of profound, selfless marital devotion to save my mental health. I would sign it, genuinely thinking I was saving my own sanity and relying on my loyal partner. And the very next business day, wielding that newly acquired, legally binding authority, he would execute a quiet, expedited distress sale directly to Grant Sutter's waiting shell company. They would legally slice the historic roof rights away from the physical structure, completely pocket the massive, 7-figure buyout, and leave me standing alone in the smoking wreckage of both my marriage and my family inheritance, entirely convinced that selling the building was my own tragic, necessary idea. The heavy, suffocating silence of the old house pressed down heavily against my shoulders. I reached out with a trembling hand and slowly pressed the screen of my laptop downward until the metal chassis clicked firmly shut. The pale blue light instantly vanished, plunging the room back into complete, profound darkness. Since walking through the front door and seeing those cream-colored sandals on the stairs, this was the first moment my professional composure truly cracked. I pressed the heels of my hands deeply into my eyes as a raw, violently bitter wave of realization washed completely over me. This was never a simple story about a man who fell out of love with his wife and into an affair with her best friend. That would have been a mundane, ordinary tragedy. I could have eventually grieved and survived. This was a meticulously planned attempt to take over my future. My husband had not merely broken our sacred wedding vows. He had looked at the secure life we built together, coldly evaluated my absolute, unwavering trust in him, and calculated its exact, liquid market value. He had put a definitive, multi-million-dollar price tag on my entire life, and he was currently upstairs, laughing in our bed, patiently waiting to cash it in. I waited until exactly 6 o'clock in the morning to make my physical presence known to the house. I had spent the entire agonizing night sitting completely rigid in the dark leather chair of my office, listening to the old floorboards settle, listening to Maris finally leave through the front door around midnight. When the first pale gray light of dawn crept through the edges of the velvet curtains, I quietly picked up my overnight bag. I opened the heavy oak front door and slammed it shut with just enough force to rattle the brass hinges. I dragged the rubber wheels of my suitcase loudly across the foyer rug, ensuring the noise echoed up the stairwell. Dean appeared at the top landing a few moments later, wearing his gray sweatpants, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and performing the role of the surprised, delighted husband flawlessly. I gave him a tired, strained smile, complaining bitterly about a fictional delayed red-eye flight, a terrible airport layover, and an exhausting cab ride through the early morning fog. He rushed down the wooden steps, wrapping his strong arms tightly around my shoulders. The cloying smell of her expensive perfume was completely gone, meticulously scrubbed away and replaced by his standard cedarwood soap. But his heartbeat felt distinctly erratic against my cheek. He bought my exhausted traveler performance entirely. At 9 o'clock. After Dean confidently kissed my forehead and left for his restoration workshop, I locked myself back in the office and made my first strategic move. I dialed the direct private line of Elise Rowan. Elise was the razor-sharp, utterly ruthless estate attorney who had meticulously handled the complex probate for Aunt Ida. She was not a woman who engaged in pleasantries or small talk. I did not offer her a tearful explanation regarding my marriage. I simply adopted my coldest professional tone and told her I strongly suspected a coordinated, highly sophisticated attempt to illegally encumber the Mercer Row property. I instructed Elise to immediately place a hard, non-removable fraud alert directly onto the master chain of title at the county registry. From that exact second forward, any proposed transfer of ownership, any newly filed contractor lien, or any requested modification to the deed structure would trigger an automatic administrative lockdown. It would require my physical presence, 2 separate forms of government identification, and Elise's personal, wet ink notarization to proceed. I effectively built an invisible, impenetrable legal fortress around the brick building while the enemy blindly thought the gates were still swinging wide open. Next, I opened my secure communications portal and contacted Jonah Pierce. Jonah and I went to the same university nearly 15 years ago, and he currently managed regional risk assessment for a massive, multi-state title insurance conglomerate. Again, I provided zero emotional background. I simply told him I was running a quiet internal audit on my own personal assets and needed a massive favor. I asked him to pull the comprehensive, raw electronic access logs for the specific Mercer Row parcel over the last 90 days. Jonah was incredibly efficient and asked no questions. By 11 o'clock that morning, a heavily encrypted data file dropped directly into my secure inbox. I spent 2 uninterrupted hours meticulously analyzing the raw data lines. There it was, hiding in a string of alphanumeric code. Exactly 4 days ago, an unidentified user had attempted to initiate a remote electronic notary session through a highly secure third-party vendor. They had uploaded a blank test document and applied a digital signature credential that was a near-perfect biometric match to my authorized signature. However, they had failed at the absolute final hurdle. The vendor's strict security protocol required a real-time, 2-factor authentication code sent directly to my personal cellular device, which they obviously did not possess. The automated system had flatly rejected the session at the very last verification step. This specific failure told me everything I needed to know. They had successfully copied my signature, digitized it flawlessly, and were currently running active dry tests to see exactly how they could bypass the final verification firewall. They were actively sharpening their weapon, trying to find a digital loophole to legitimize the forgery before presenting the final management authorization to the city. I could not leave my financial flanks exposed while they experimented. I picked up the phone again and called my private wealth manager at the commercial bank. I instituted a complete, absolute freeze on the operating accounts holding the generated rental cash flow from the downtown bookstore and the residential lofts. I placed a strict overriding lock on any beneficiary modifications, completely halted any future credit line expansions tied to the property equity, and specifically revoked any implied joint access privileges Dean might try to leverage in an emergency. If they successfully manipulated the city council and tried to drain the existing capital to secretly fund their legal maneuvers or pay off Sutter's fixers, they would find the bank vault welded entirely shut. The logical, expected reaction for any victim in this scenario would be to march straight down to the local police precinct, slam the digital logs on a cynical detective's desk, and demand an immediate arrest for attempted corporate fraud. But my 10 years of experience dictated otherwise. Police departments move agonizingly slowly. They require undeniable, concrete proof of executed financial harm. Not just preliminary cyber trespassing and a drafted document. A clumsy uniformed detective showing up at Dean's workshop with a few questions would simply spook them. They would instantly delete the email drafts, shred the forged temporary authorization papers, burn the burner laptops, and calmly claim it was a massive administrative misunderstanding. I did not want to merely scare them away from my property. I wanted to completely, systematically obliterate the entire criminal architecture they had so arrogantly built. I needed them to feel safe. I needed to let them confidently execute the final, fatal stages of their plan, capturing every single piece of undeniable, prosecutable evidence along the way. I required the cord to be of sufficient length so that every single person could execute their synchronized acrobatic routine at the exact same time before a crowd of onlookers. That evening, Dean came home carrying a bottle of my favorite expensive red wine and a lavish bouquet of white lilies. He cooked dinner from scratch, humming a soft, cheerful tune in the kitchen. As we sat across from each other at the polished dining table, he reached across the wood and gently took my hand. His thumb stroked my knuckles with practiced, sickening tenderness. He looked at me with deep, entirely manufactured concern shadowing his eyes. "You look so incredibly exhausted, Stella," he murmured, his baritone voice dripping with heavy, suffocating empathy. "You work way too hard at the firm, and I know the city zoning board has been hounding you relentlessly with those ridiculous code violations on the Mercer Row building. It is taking a massive toll on your health. Why do you not just let me handle the building administration for a little while? I can manage the repair contractors, deal with the aggressive city inspectors, and handle the tenant complaints. You should just focus on resting and recovering." His performance was absolutely breathtaking, but because I knew exactly what to listen for, I could clearly hear the microscopic, vibrating tremor of raw impatience buried deep beneath his soothing tone. The financial pressure from Grant Sutter must be intensifying by the hour. Dean desperately needed that legally binding signature, and he needed it before the current fiscal week ended. I looked directly into the eyes of the man I had slept next to for 5 years. I let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly mimicking the heavy posture of a defeated, completely overwhelmed woman. I offered him a weak, incredibly grateful smile. I squeezed his hand back. I told him softly that maybe he was entirely right. That maybe I just desperately needed a long break from the crushing administrative burden of the estate. A sudden, brilliant flash of pure, unadulterated triumph ignited in the very depths of his pupils, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He genuinely thought he had won the war. He thought he was expertly reeling in a tired, blind, and unsuspecting fish. He did not realize that from that exact moment forward, I was no longer playing the role of the tragically deceived wife. I had willingly become the bait, heavily laced with poison, silently inviting the predator to take a massive, fatal bite. The invitation arrived precisely 3 days after my early return from the canceled conference. The phone call came directly to my personal line, bubbling with a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured enthusiasm that Maris typically reserved for her wealthiest philanthropic donors. She was hosting the annual spring gala for her urban conservation nonprofit, an opulent affair designed to loosen the purse strings of the city elite. She insisted, with that cloying, sisterly warmth, that I absolutely had to be there. She acted completely oblivious, playing her designated role with the terrifying ease of a seasoned sociopath. I accepted the invitation with matching, flawless cheerfulness. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and bypassed the understated, conservative cocktail dresses I usually favored for professional networking events. Instead, my hands brushed against the cool, heavy fabric of a floor-length, deep emerald silk gown. I pulled it from the rack. I vividly remembered a sunny afternoon 6 months ago, sipping sparkling water in a downtown designer boutique, when Maris had forcefully insisted I buy this exact dress. She had run her hands over the delicate stitching and declared that it was a fiercely difficult garment to pull off, but that I possessed the exact, intimidating aura required to wear it. Tonight, I was not going to dress like a grieving, heartbroken wife. I was going to wear her complement as a suit of armor. I was going to completely own the room long before the real war officially detonated. When Dean and I arrived at the historic vaulted ballroom shortly after 8 o'clock in the evening, the grand space was already glittering with crystal chandeliers, overflowing champagne towers, and elaborate floral installations. Dean played his part to absolute perfection. He stood exceptionally tall in his tailored tuxedo, keeping his hand resting possessively and protectively on the curve of my lower back. He navigated the crowded room with the smooth, practiced charm of a devoted husband showcasing his beautiful, successful wife. It took less than 15 minutes for Maris to spot us through the sea of expensive suits and sequined gowns. She glided across the polished marble floor, radiating the manicured, glowing energy of a highly successful hostess. She reached out, grasping my shoulders tightly, and pulled me into a deep, familiar embrace. The faint, nauseating scent of her expensive floral perfume filled my lungs, the exact same scent that had lingered in my front hallway just a few days prior. "You came," Maris whispered, pressing her carefully rouged cheek against mine. "And you wore the silk. You look absolutely breathtaking." "Darling, I would never miss your big night," I replied, pulling back just enough to look directly into her perfectly lined eyes. My smile was razor-sharp, expertly fixed into place. "You have clearly put an incredible amount of work into all of this. It takes a village." She laughed lightly, squeezing my arm before turning her brilliant, utterly fake smile toward my husband. "Dean, thank you so much for bringing her out. I know she has been so overwhelmed with the estate paperwork lately." The sheer, staggering audacity of the exchange sent a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline straight through my veins. They were performing a grotesque pantomime of loyalty and friendship right in front of 200 wealthy guests. But the true, horrifying scope of their alliance did not fully materialize until I glanced past her shoulder. Standing near the massive ice sculpture at the center of the room, holding a tumbler of dark amber liquor, was Grant Sutter. He was dressed in a pristine midnight blue tuxedo, radiating the quiet, predatory confidence of a man accustomed to buying whatever he wanted. The heavy glossy event program in my hand listed his commercial development firm as the exclusive platinum sponsor for the evening. For the first time, I saw all three of them in the same room, bound by the same greed. Maris provided the social cover and the nonprofit legitimacy. Grant Sutter provided the massive, endless pool of capital. Dean provided the inside access and the marital leverage. They were a perfectly calibrated machine, and I was the only obstacle standing in their way. I excused myself from the conversation under the polite pretense of needing to visit the ladies' room. I navigated through the crowded main hall, purposely slipping past the heavy velvet curtains that separated the public ballroom from the private, chaotic staging corridors used by the event coordinators. I needed a moment of absolute silence to steady my racing pulse. As I walked down the dimly lit service hallway, I passed a temporary administrative station set up on a folding table. It was littered with abandoned clipboards, scattered seating charts, and open vendor binders. A single, brightly highlighted budget reconciliation spreadsheet caught my eye. My professional instincts, honed by years of forensic auditing, forcefully took over. I stopped and quickly scanned the columns of numbers. The listed expenses for the evening were staggeringly high, but one specific line item practically screamed at me from the page. There was an authorization for $55,000 allocated entirely for custom structural staging and heavy timber decorative partitions. The designated payee was listed as Oakline Logistics. My breath hitched sharply in the quiet corridor. Oakline Logistics was not a premier event management company. It was an obscure, secondary shell supplier that Dean had occasionally used years ago to quietly import bulk lumber for his restoration workshop. The pieces slammed together with blinding speed. Maris was not merely using her friendship with me to secure my signature for a real estate deal. She was actively exploiting her own charitable organization. She was intentionally inflating the operational costs of this lavish gala, taking thousands of dollars of donated philanthropic funds and funneling the illicit difference directly into a dummy vendor account controlled by Dean. She was secretly pumping stolen cash into his failing business, keeping his financial head just above water so he could flawlessly maintain the illusion of stability until they successfully forced the sale of my inherited building. It was blatant, textbook corporate embezzlement. I pulled my secondary, untraceable mobile phone from my slim velvet clutch, my hands moving with surgical precision. I activated the high-definition audio recording application and left the screen running dark. I slipped the device back into the clutch, leaving the golden clasp slightly open to expose the microphone. I turned back toward the main ballroom, but instead of re-entering through the front doors, I walked toward the exterior stone terrace. The cool evening air washed over me. I moved silently along the shadowed perimeter of the balcony, just beyond a massive potted fern. Standing in the secluded darkness away from the prying eyes of the party were Dean and Grant Sutter. I pressed my back completely flat against the rough stone wall, blending into the heavy shadows, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The ambient, muffled bass of the string quartet playing inside covered the sound of my approach. "The board members are getting extremely anxious about the timeline," Grant said, his voice low, aggressive, and completely devoid of the polite charm he displayed inside. "I cannot hold the adjacent parcels in limbo forever. I am bleeding capital every single month we wait on this." "You need to relax, Grant," Dean replied. I could hear the distinct sound of ice clinking against glass as he shifted his weight. "She is exhausted. I am wearing her down day by day." She completely bought the narrative about needing a break from the administrative stress. "The documents are perfectly prepared. Once management transfers, the financing lands. Just make sure she signs the damn paper by Friday," Grant muttered, turning away to head back inside. "Or I pull the entire plug, and you and Maris are left holding nothing but a mountain of debt." I stood perfectly still in the freezing shadows for a full 60 seconds after they separated. I reached into my clutch and quietly stopped the recording. I had it. I had the explicit, undeniable vocal confirmation of the conspiracy, mentioning the forged transfer of management and the contingent financing, cleanly captured and safely stored. I took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp night air. I smoothed the invisible wrinkles from the heavy emerald silk of my dress. I walked back into the blinding light of the ballroom, found my husband, and offered him a radiant, loving smile. As Dean wrapped his arm proudly around my waist for the final hour of the gala, he had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath him had completely vanished. From that specific, defining night forward, my meticulously planned retaliation was no longer a simple matter of punishing an unfaithful husband. It was a calculated financial counterattack aimed at bringing down everyone who had mistaken my kindness for weakness. The following afternoon, the oppressive humidity of the southern coast pressed heavily against the glass panes of my office window. I was systematically reviewing the dummy vendor invoices from the gala when a secure notification chimed softly from my desktop. It was an encrypted data packet from Jonah Pierce. Attached to the heavily shielded file was a brief, highly professional note stating he had run a deeper, secondary diagnostic on the regional title archives. specifically pulling outdated municipal appraisal queries that cross-referenced my maiden name and the downtown zoning grid. He mentioned it was a standard historical sweep, just in case my internal audit required long-term context. I downloaded the compressed folder, my eyes scanning the seemingly mundane list of file names. They appeared to be nothing more than routine. Outdated tax assessments and forgotten historical preservation surveys dating back nearly a full decade. However, my forensic training dictated that I examine everything. I opened a specific digital communication thread that had been flagged by the search algorithm. It was a forwarded email chain between a prominent municipal architect and an independent zoning consultant. I checked the initial routing metadata. The origin timestamp was dated exactly 8 years ago. This was a profoundly significant date. It was well before I had ever crossed paths with my husband, before I had secured my senior position at the settlement firm, and long before Aunt Ida had even fallen ill. I clicked open the root message. The registered sender of the original inquiry was Maris Vale. The blood drained entirely from my face, leaving my skin cold and tight. In the brief, clinical text of the message, she explicitly asked the city architect to quietly and unofficially evaluate the potential commercial zoning value of the Baker Building on Mercer Row, specifically if it were legally grafted to the empty lot directly behind it. I read the sentence 3 times. She was aggressively hunting the hidden value of my family's asset before she ever introduced herself to me at a local networking luncheon. She had targeted the property long before she ever pretended to be my closest friend. My fingers were entirely numb, heavy and uncoordinated, as I scrolled further up the chronological progression of the thread. The timestamps jumped forward by exactly 6 months. A new external email address was suddenly carbon copied into the quiet. Highly technical discussion regarding structural easements and maximum building heights. The name formally attached to the address was Dean Hollowell. I stared unblinking at the glowing screen, the specific date burning itself permanently into my retinas. It was the exact same month and the exact same year that I first met Dean. I remembered that crisp autumn weekend vividly. I had been standing behind a folding table at a crowded downtown antique market, selling off a few minor pieces of Aunt Ida's overflow furniture to clear space. He had walked right up to my booth, radiating a charming, rugged warmth, and asked incredibly thoughtful questions about a restored mahogany side table. He had bought me a cup of coffee exactly 1 hour later. The air in my home office turned to solid, unyielding ice. I was suddenly forced to look directly at the most terrifying, ruthless possibility a human being could ever confront. Dean might have eventually developed some twisted, complicated form of genuine affection or comfortable habit with me over the course of our 5-year marriage. But his initial approach, his very first blinding smile, and his entire seamless introduction into my life were fundamentally tied to the appraised architectural value of the brick walls I stood to inherit. This was the absolute deepest, most fatal wound of the entire nightmare. It was a complete structural failure of my own personal history. A desperate, lonely woman had not simply stolen my husband in a momentary lapse of marital judgment. The absolute, undeniable truth was that my entire marriage had likely never been clean from its very foundation. It was a highly calculated, multi-year acquisition strategy expertly masquerading as a sweeping romance. I closed the laptop chassis with a soft, definitive click. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply stood up from my leather chair, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to the historic district. I let myself into the heavy iron back door of the property. I walked silently past the quiet, comforting hum of the ground floor bookstore and climbed the rear wooden staircase to the designated archival storage room on the first level. I locked the heavy brass deadbolt securely behind me. The familiar smell of dry paper, aged wood, and dust filled the confined space. Without any warning, my knees simply gave out. I collapsed entirely onto the scuffed hardwood floor, the rough, uneven grain biting sharply through my thin trousers. I curled my knees tightly toward my chest. Wrapping my arms fiercely around my own legs, I allowed my body to shake. I let the violent, uncontrollable physical tremors of profound, soul-crushing betrayal tear through my muscles for a few rare, completely silent minutes. The pain was not a sharp, sudden stab to the heart. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, exactly like being buried alive under tons of freezing, wet dirt. Every single memory I possessed had just been retroactively poisoned. But I did not stay on the floor. I am not a woman who breaks and remains broken. I forced myself to stand, aggressively brushing the accumulated dust from my clothes. I walked out of the dim storage room and ascended to the second level of the building. I unlocked the heavy oak door to a small, private alcove that Aunt Ida had used as a personal reading study, tucked deeply inside a forgotten, cedar-lined supply closet, resting beneath a heavy woolen blanket. I found a heavy brass-bound wooden lockbox. I knew the combination by heart, a simple, 4-digit sequence matching her birth year. The heavy brass tumblers clicked open smoothly. Inside, resting beneath a thick stack of brittle, yellowed architectural drawings and heavily faded property deeds, were several handwritten documents bound by a frayed silk ribbon. I slipped the top paper from the neat stack. It was penned in Aunt Ida's sharp, elegant, and instantly recognizable cursive handwriting. It was not a gentle, sentimental goodbye letter meant to comfort a grieving niece. It was a direct, fiercely worded legal and strategic directive aimed squarely at whoever managed the estate after her eventual passing. The blue ink was faded by time, but the final sentence at the very bottom of the heavy parchment paper was underlined twice with absolute, unapologetic authority. It read, "Never let them split the roof rights from the building." Aunt Ida had known. She had possessed the sharp, intuitive foresight to clearly recognize the true, predatory nature of downtown commercial development. She had felt the distinct, looming premonition that opportunistic, greedy people would eventually circle her property like starving vultures, desperately searching for any legal loophole to sever the technical, highly lucrative access rights from the physical brick and mortar. She had left me a perfectly drawn map of the danger, and I had nearly handed it directly to the exact thieves she had warned me about. I carefully folded the heavy paper and placed it securely inside the zippered pocket of my leather bag. As I locked the brass box and walked back down the quiet, shadowed staircase of my building, the very last lingering fragment of the woman who simply wanted to save her marriage completely died. I no longer cared about confronting my husband with his infidelity. I no longer cared about reclaiming a stolen relationship, attending couples therapy, or demanding a tearful, pathetic apology in our living room. I did not want my husband back in any capacity. I wanted a total, absolute, and scorching reckoning. They had meticulously calculated the precise, liquid value of my life, my history, and my family legacy. From this specific second forward, my singular, consuming objective was to force every single person who had conspired to rewrite my destiny to pay the absolute maximum penalty, calculated and executed entirely according to their own fraudulent paperwork. I sat at the massive kitchen island the following evening, nursing a steaming porcelain cup of bitter chamomile tea. I consciously let my posture sag forward, allowing the natural, dark exhaustion circles under my eyes to speak volumes for themselves. Dean was standing a few feet away by the expensive gas stove, stirring a heavy pot of dinner, effortlessly playing the role of the ultimate domestic provider. "I really cannot keep doing this," I whispered, carefully injecting a heavy, authentic-sounding tremor into my voice. "The settlement firm is demanding 60 hours a week from me right now, and these relentless municipal code violations on the historic property are draining every single ounce of mental energy I have left. I am completely overwhelmed. Maybe I should just temporarily delegate some of this administrative nightmare to a professional, just to reduce the crushing pressure." Dean froze for a microscopic fraction of a second. The wooden stirring spoon in his right hand paused suspended over the cast iron pot. He slowly turned around, his handsome face transforming into a flawless, practiced mask of gentle, loving concern. He walked over to the kitchen island, placing his warm, strong hands on my tense shoulders, and began massaging the tight muscles with practiced familiarity. "You have been carrying this massive, unfair burden entirely by yourself for way too long," he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the top of my head. "You need to protect your health first. We could easily find a neutral third-party property manager, someone who can handle the aggressive city inspectors and the endless tenant complaints while you step back. Take a breath and just focus on your career." I knew exactly where that seemingly neutral recommendation would inevitably lead. It would be a direct, undisputed pipeline straight to Rook Point Holdings. I leaned my head back against his chest, closing my eyes to hide the cold, calculating glare burning in my pupils. "Maybe you are right," I replied, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. "I just want to be free of it for a little while." Later that same evening, my mobile phone vibrated softly against the wooden nightstand. It was a long text message from Maris. She was checking in with the polished, intensely soothing tone of a model best friend. "Dean mentioned you are feeling incredibly stressed about the estate paperwork lately," she wrote. "Please do not let that old building destroy your peace of mind. You deserve to free yourself from that heavy burden. Let me know if you need me to come over on Tuesday afternoon and help you organize the files." Her carefully chosen words were an absolute masterclass in subtle psychological manipulation, designed to gently guide me toward the exact idea of surrendering my inheritance while simultaneously fishing for my upcoming travel schedule. I typed a reply thanking her profusely for her endless, beautiful support, confirming that I was seriously considering taking a massive step back from managing the property. Every single interaction was a meticulously choreographed, high-stakes dance, and I was quietly leading them exactly where I needed them to go, to completely solidify Dean's false sense of ultimate security. I began intentionally performing small, calculated acts of manufactured carelessness around the house. Over the next 3 days, I would casually bring minor, harmless municipal tax updates or basic plumbing repair invoices into the living room after dinner. I would sigh heavily, barely glance at the dense legal text, and quickly scribble my signature at the absolute bottom of the page while he watched me from the leather sofa. I was actively, systematically conditioning him to believe that my professional guard was completely dismantled, that I was so thoroughly exhausted I would blindly sign anything placed directly in front of me without reading the clauses, while Dean and Maris were busy quietly celebrating their impending lucrative victory. The real, devastating war was being waged in absolute secrecy. I spent my designated lunch hours locked inside a soundproof corporate conference room, engaging in secure, untraceable calls with Elise Rowan. My fiercely intelligent attorney was systematically drafting a massive, earth-shattering civil lawsuit. The legal filing detailed a conspiracy to commit property fraud, an abuse of marital trust, and illegal interference with private assets. We were not merely going to stop their impending transaction. We were going to legally and financially annihilate them. Simultaneously, Elise executed a brilliant, impenetrable defensive maneuver regarding the physical real estate. We legally transferred the entire Mercer Row property deed deep into a highly specialized, irrevocable title protection trust. This advanced legal structure mandated 2 distinct, unalterable layers of physical, in-person verification for any future transaction or management shift. No digital signature, no matter how flawlessly forged or technologically advanced, would ever be accepted by the county clerks. Any attempt to use their forged documents would be blocked immediately at the county level. I also prepared a highly specific, explosive delivery for Maris, using a public computer terminal at a quiet downtown library branch. I compiled a heavily redacted, anonymous financial dossier. It contained the drastically inflated gala expense reports side by side with the direct, hidden payment transfers made to the dummy shell company operated by Dean. I placed the damning documents into 5 separate, stark white envelopes and mailed them directly to the private residential addresses of the 5 most senior, wealthy members of her nonprofit board of directors. I could already imagine the chaos those envelopes would cause when they were opened the next morning. The final piece of the trap fell into place late Thursday afternoon. Jonah contacted me through a secure channel with an urgent update about the regional wire system. Grant Sutter's lender had suddenly balked at the last minute. The aggressive bank underwriters were unexpectedly demanding a final physical verification of the property management authorization before they would legally disperse the multi-million-dollar acquisition funds to Sutter's development firm. This unexpected bureaucratic hurdle meant Grant Sutter could no longer simply hide behind his slick corporate lawyers and wait for the dust to settle. He desperately needed the completely executed, legally binding paperwork physically in his hand immediately to secure his massive financing. If the complex land deal failed to officially close by the end of this current week, his entire luxury hotel project would default on its preliminary high-interest loans. This specific banking requirement gave me the ultimate, undeniable power. I had the unique, fleeting opportunity to blow up the entire commercial transaction right at the exact point of closure, forcing all of them out into the blinding light. When Dean came home that evening, he casually mentioned over a glass of wine that he had arranged a preliminary signing session with a neutral legal mediator for the following morning. He smoothly framed it as a simple, zero-pressure meeting to review some basic temporary management options, promising it would only take 30 minutes of my time. He smiled, his eyes shining with the barely contained thrill of a man who thought he had finally won the lottery. I looked directly at him, offering a tired, thoroughly compliant nod. I agreed to attend the session. I was absolutely not going there to compromise. I was not going there to negotiate a fair surrender. I was willingly going exactly where they wanted me to go, because that was where they would finally walk straight into the trap. The morning of the final meeting broke with a heavy, suffocating humidity that promised a violent afternoon thunderstorm. I was sitting alone at my kitchen island at 6 o'clock in the morning, running one last, routine diagnostic on my personal financial dashboards before heading downtown to the mediator. The house was entirely silent. Dean was still upstairs, sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who believed his ultimate victory was only a few hours away. I clicked onto the secondary portal of my commercial bank, intending only to verify the lockdown status of the accounts. That was when I saw the discrepancy. It was a digital blow so sudden and brutal that it temporarily robbed the oxygen from my lungs. Dean had managed to find a microscopic, almost invisible crack in the financial armor I had meticulously built around the property. While my wealth manager had successfully frozen the primary operating cash flows and the master equity lines, Dean had quietly exploited an antiquated secondary overdraft protection tier attached specifically to the building's historical renovation fund. It was an archaic credit facility established nearly 10 years ago, one that had somehow bypassed the bank's modern security sweep. He had drained it. He had completely, ruthlessly zeroed it out. $85,000, capital strictly earmarked for structural masonry repairs, had been wire transferred out of the account exactly 12 hours prior. For a terrifying, blinding moment, my hands began to shake. The sheer, unadulterated greed of the theft threatened to crack my carefully maintained composure. I wanted to march up the wooden stairs, tear the heavy blankets off the bed, and demand to know how he could look me in the eye while casually stealing my safety net. But I forced my hands flat against the cold marble countertop. I breathed in for 4 seconds, held it for 4 seconds, and exhaled for 4. I let the analytical, calculating side of my brain violently suppress the emotional hemorrhage. I did not explode. Instead, I realized exactly what he had just inadvertently handed me. By draining that specific renovation fund without my explicit, written, and notarized consent, Dean had fundamentally altered his legal standing. He was no longer just a greedy, unfaithful husband attempting to legally manipulate a property transfer. He had just committed undeniable, documented wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I calmly connected my laptop to the heavy home office printer and printed the entire transaction history, adding the freshly inked pages to the growing arsenal inside my leather briefcase. I was going to use his own desperate theft to drive the final nail into his coffin. Before driving to the law office, I made a necessary detour to the historic district. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the Mercer Row property and walked through the heavy morning fog to the ground-floor bookstore. The bell above the door chimed a familiar, comforting greeting. The elderly woman who owned the shop was already awake, carefully arranging a display of vintage leather-bound novels. She had leased this specific commercial space for over 2 decades and had possessed a deep, unwavering affection for Aunt Ida. I did not tell her about the impending divorce, the forgery, or the sprawling conspiracy. I simply told her that I was conducting a deep, comprehensive audit of the building's historical lease structures and wanted to ensure my files perfectly matched hers. She smiled warmly, walked behind the heavy mahogany counter, and pulled a battered green metal lockbox from beneath the register. "Your aunt was a brilliant, highly cautious woman, Stella," she said, her voice raspy but sharp. She always insisted on keeping the original physical copies. She never completely trusted those computers. She handed me a thin, yellowed piece of heavy parchment paper. It was an original lease addendum, completely undigitized, signed by Aunt Ida and the bookstore owner 20 years ago. As I read the typed legal clauses, a cold, triumphant thrill washed over my entire body. The addendum contained a highly specific, ironclad covenant regarding the structural integrity of the commercial space. It explicitly stated that any physical or legal alteration to the building's roof access rights, or any modification to the shared emergency egress pathways, required a mandatory 90-day written notification to the primary commercial tenant. Furthermore, if such alterations were made without this notification and formal tenant approval, the action would immediately invalidate the certificate of occupancy, allowing the tenant to place a hard legal injunction against the property owner. In the complex, unforgiving world of commercial real estate development, this single, fragile piece of paper was a hidden landmine of catastrophic proportions. Even if Dean, Maris, and Grant somehow miraculously managed to force me into signing the forged management authorization today, Grant's massive boutique hotel project would still completely collapse. The moment his construction crews attempted to legally sever the roof rights to secure their municipal permits, this undisclosed tenant covenant would trigger a massive legal blockade. Grant Sutter was blindly walking into a multi-million-dollar real estate deal, completely unaware of a hidden liability that would permanently paralyze his entire flagship development. I carefully slid the yellowed addendum into a protective plastic sleeve and placed it securely next to the bank statements in my bag. The final discussion was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning at the sleek, towering offices of a supposedly neutral legal mediation firm in the financial district. It was an environment expressly designed to intimidate. The conference room featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls, an oversized polished mahogany table, and stark, minimalist leather chairs. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, the sheer, staggering hypocrisy of the scene waiting for me nearly took my breath away. Dean was already seated near the head of the table. He immediately stood up, his handsome face pulling into a mask of deep, manufactured sympathy. He quickly pulled a chair out for me, hovering protectively over my shoulder. Seated directly across from him was Maris. She had positioned herself there under the incredibly vile pretense of serving as my dedicated moral support. She offered me a soft, reassuring smile, lightly touching her hand to her chest in a gesture of absolute, fake solidarity, and sitting quietly at the far end of the expansive table, reviewing a thick folder of documents with a bored, detached expression, was Grant Sutter. He was officially attending this session under the highly sanitized guise of a casual, independent investor simply looking to purchase some minor future development rights to ease my financial burden. The stage was perfectly set. The actors were flawlessly in their assigned positions. I sank heavily into the leather chair Dean had pulled out for me. I deliberately let my shoulders round forward. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood of the table, projecting the exact image of a thoroughly broken, completely exhausted woman who had finally reached the absolute end of her rope. I made sure my breathing was shallow, my movements slow and heavy. Dean leaned down, his expensive cedarwood aftershave filling the space between us. and placed a manicured hand over mine. "You are doing the right thing, Stella," he whispered smoothly. "We are going to get all of this crushing pressure off your shoulders today. I promise." I did not pull my hand away. I simply offered him a weak, barely perceptible nod. Beneath the shadow of the massive mahogany table, the heavy leather of my briefcase rested firmly against my right calf. Inside that bag, neatly organized and completely primed for detonation, was the high-definition audio recording from the gala terrace. Right behind it was the comprehensive title trace report, the failed electronic notary authentication logs proving the digital forgery, the printed cash flow statements detailing his $85,000 embezzlement, the bookstore lease addendum, and finally, the devastating civil lawsuit that Elise Rowan had already signed and legally filed with the county clerk exactly 1 hour ago. As the neutral mediator cleared his throat to officially begin the session, the heavy silence in the room stretched taut like a steel wire about to snap. I looked up through my eyelashes, slowly taking in the faces of the 3 people who had confidently plotted to dismantle my entire existence. Grant was impatiently checking his expensive watch. Maris was looking at me with eyes full of poisonous, fake pity. And Dean was watching the mediator, a microscopic, deeply arrogant smirk playing at the very corner of his mouth. He was the only person in this sterile, freezing room who genuinely believed he had already won the war before the first shot was even fired. He believed I was a blind, tragic victim willingly handing over the keys to my kingdom. And as my fingers silently traced the brass clasp of my hidden briefcase, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that his unshakable arrogance was exactly what would make his impending catastrophic freefall the most painful experience of his entire life. The neutral mediator cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses before gesturing toward the center of the heavy mahogany table. Dean leaned forward, his movements agonizingly slow and practiced. He slid the thick manila folder across the polished wood until it rested exactly 2 inches from my folded hands. His voice dropped to a soft, incredibly gentle register, perfectly designed to sound like a man solely concerned for his wife. "This is just a temporary management authorization, Stella," Dean murmured, offering a reassuring, deeply fake smile. "Just sign right there at the bottom. It will let you finally rest for a few months while I handle the city inspectors." I did not pick up the silver pen resting beside the folder. I slowly reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. I did not look at the signature line. Instead, I lifted my gaze, looking straight past my husband, locking my eyes entirely on Maris, who was sitting perfectly still on the opposite side of the expansive table. My voice was incredibly soft, barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the sterile air of the conference room like a surgical blade. "Then why does the company set to benefit trace directly back to Rook Point Holdings?" The entire room violently froze. It was as if the oxygen had been instantly sucked through the air vents. Maris dropped her gaze, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. For the very first time since the meeting began, Grant Sutter turned his head sharply. He shot a dark, entirely unfriendly glare directly at Dean. In that terrifying instant, the developer realized I knew far more than a heartbroken wife who had accidentally found proof of an affair. I reached down and calmly snapped open the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. I did not rush. I placed the items onto the polished mahogany one by one, deliberately building the architecture of their absolute destruction. First, I placed the glossy, high-resolution photograph of the cream sandals sitting at the bottom of my staircase. Next, I laid down the printed smart lock access logs, highlighting every Tuesday afternoon entry. Beside that, I placed the local printer memory cache, proving the exact time they scanned my property deed. Then, the failed digital notary authentication logs exposing the forged electronic signature. I followed it with the heavily redacted bank statements showing Dean's desperate $85,000 withdrawal, placed neatly alongside the inflated gala staging invoices from her nonprofit. Finally, I placed my mobile phone perfectly in the center of the table. I tapped the screen once. The high-definition audio recording echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, filling the freezing room with Grant's own aggressive voice. Once management transfers, the financing lands, Dean's handsome face drained of all color, turning a sickly, pale gray. He scrambled backward in his leather chair, his hands raised in a frantic, defensive gesture. He stammered, his voice cracking violently as he tried to forcefully spin the narrative, claiming it was all a massive marital misunderstanding, a desperate attempt to protect me from my own financial stress. Before he could finish his pathetic fabrication, the heavy glass door to the conference room swung open with a sharp click. Elise Rowan strode inside, wearing an immaculate charcoal suit, radiating absolute, unyielding authority. She was closely flanked by the senior executive representative from the regional title insurance conglomerate. Elise did not bother with formal introductions. She slammed a heavily stamped legal binder onto the table, officially announcing to the mediator that a permanent fraud alert was fully active on the Mercer Row master deed. Every single commercial transaction, transfer, or encumbrance was indefinitely blocked by the county clerk. Grant Sutter immediately jumped to his feet, his chair violently scraping against the hardwood floor. He aggressively pointed a finger at Dean, frantically attempting to sever his professional ties, declaring he had absolutely no prior knowledge of any domestic forgery and demanding his development firm be kept out of their messy divorce. I looked up at the panicked developer. I pulled the final, clear plastic sleeve from my bag. I slid the yellowed, 20-year-old lease addendum and Aunt Ida's handwritten warning directly across the wood toward him. I told him in a perfectly flat tone that even if they had successfully forged my signature today, the historic roof rights and emergency egress pathways were legally bound to the ground floor tenant's explicit approval. I informed him that his flagship hotel project was entirely dead the very moment he bought the adjacent dirt. Across the table, a sharp mechanical buzzing shattered the silence. Maris's mobile phone began to vibrate violently against the wood. It buzzed once, twice, then erupted into a continuous, frantic vibration. The 5 senior board members of her conservation charity were currently opening their morning mail. Maris stared down at the glowing screen, her perfectly lined eyes wide with terror. Realizing that her carefully built public image was unraveling in real time, the sheer compounding weight of the collapsing conspiracy finally broke Dean. He completely lost his carefully constructed composure. His face flushed a dark, furious red. He slammed his fists onto the table, leaning aggressively over the scattered evidence. He screamed that I was ruining everything, that he had built my life up, and that he inherently deserved half of that historic building. Then, completely blinded by rage, the fatal words tore violently from his throat. I put 8 years into this. 8 years. That single, desperate sentence hung in the cold air, completely destroying the absolute last, microscopic illusion of our marriage. He had spoken the quiet part out loud, confirming exactly what I had discovered in the archives. It was never about love. It was a hostile acquisition from the very first day we met. I did not scream. I did not cause a scene. I simply stood up. Smoothing the front of my silk skirt. I pushed the unsigned management authorization straight off the edge of the table, letting the pages scatter onto the floor. Elise smoothly handed the pail. Sweating mediator the official civil lawsuit, formally serving Dean and Maris with corporate fraud, marital embezzlement, and illegal property interference. I picked up my empty leather briefcase, turned my back on the mess they had made, and walked out through the glass doors. The Mercer Row property remained exactly where it belonged. Over the next 12 months, I completely transformed the historic building. I utilized the protected equity to renovate the upper lofts and the expansive main floor into a bright, collaborative workspace exclusively leased to local female entrepreneurs, independent artists, and small business owners. Dean's high-end restoration workshop completely folded within 90 days after the commercial bank aggressively called in his defaulted loans. Maris was quietly but forcefully ousted from her organization, entirely exiled from the city's elite social circles, leaving town shortly after. Grant Sutter was forced to liquidate the adjacent empty parcels at a massive financial loss when his institutional financing permanently collapsed. I kept the brick building, but vastly more important than the real estate. I retained the absolute, undeniable right to write the rest of my own story with my own two hands. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.